Let's jump right into the Romans study. Romans 14, Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food. Oh my. We're finally in verse 19. We're making progress. We just got through looking at the question of food and really what does Paul mean when he says nothing is unclean in and of itself. And we've determined that much of the chapter has to deal with food. Really, most of the sections that Paul addresses have to do with differences between preferences of clean and unclean, or common, unholy, profane, special fast days, days that people were meeting to get together, maybe for table fellowship and things like that. What we also learned is from the overall context that Paul's likely not addressing Sabbath versus Sunday issues when he said earlier that one man considers one day special and another man considers all days alike. If you look at the overall context, it is very highly likely. There's a margin of error here, obviously, because sometimes you just can't know for sure. There's more than one way that a verse could go, but it's highly likely, and this is the thesis that I'm going with, is that when he talks about one man saying one day is special, one day others saying that they're all alike, he's talking about fast days, which were not mandated by the Torah. Meaning, some people are going to say it's on one day and some people are going to say it's on another day, and it doesn't matter really if you're not all in agreement, just as long as you don't fight about it, because the Torah doesn't come down on one side of the fence or the other. It leaves that open to you when it comes to fast days. And so that's also related to food. What we're learning from the larger context is that in this part of Paul's letter, he's recognizing the socio-religious breakdown of the two groups that are in front of him. Of course, he wasn't there when he wrote the letter. He's probably writing it from Corinth in the mid-50s of his day, before he even went to Rome. But the two groups are the weak and the strong, aka the Jews and the Gentiles. The Jews would have been recognized by the Gentiles as the weak, and the word weak there is probably attached to their preference for not just keeping Torah within a context of maintaining faithfulness to God, but more specifically, as Mark Nanos has demonstrated, there's a strong case that can be made that the weakness is directly attached to their lack of accepting Yeshua as Messiah formally yet. So, I'll put a little graphic on the screen here in post-production that shows you some of the breakdown. But I'm going with that thesis as well because I think it fits the overall context of Paul's letter, that Paul's working with Jews and Gentiles who were still close enough in contact with one another that synagogue participation from the Gentile side of the house was still available. It was still open to them, and they would have been meeting unbelieving Jews in those meetings, and so those were the weak. The strong, of course, are Jewish and Gentile Christians who do believe in Jesus, and whatever particulars they keep. Strong, the strong part, the adjective of strong, is attached to their faith in Jesus, not their preference for keeping Torah. So let me just say it this way, so that, and then we'll jump right into the study. I do not subscribe to an interpretation that attaches weak or strong to a person's preference for keeping Torah. That is today's 21st century popular opinion among most Christian Bible study groups and pastors and sermons and seminaries and seminarians and things like that. And it's kind of the historic position that the Christian church has taken for a long time. But that position cannot be sustained. It cannot be held up in light of what the Torah teaches about walking in Torah elsewhere. In other words, we have several passages in the prophets where God talks about pouring His Spirit out on Israel, and the result would be that they would walk into His Torah. Jeremiah 31 has some wording about that. Ezekiel 36 talks about that. And we also know that from Paul's own testimony that he himself was a lifelong Torah keeper, not a Torah breaker. He was a Sabbath keeper, he was a kosher keeper, he was a festival keeper. So he kept Torah, and he, as far as we can tell, he would have encouraged people he wrote to keep Torah as well. So why would he suddenly switch gears and label someone as keeping Torah as weak, meaning he himself would be in that camp. And he would be especially interpreting that when God spoke to the prophets and told them, be filled with my spirit and walk in my ways. Oh, and by the way, that'll make you a weak person. This would also make Yeshua's statement in Matthew 5, where he talks about, I didn't come to do away with law, but to fulfill it. And those who keep the law and teach others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And those who don't keep the Torah and teach others not to keep it will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Go back and read it, Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. Interestingly, if Paul says that keeping the Torah is a sign of weakness, well, then what he's saying with Yeshua's words is that keep the Torah and teach others to do so, you'll be called great in the kingdom, but you'll be weak. See how that connects together? That doesn't make for good exegesis. So it also means that Paul himself would be one of the weak if he's a Torah keeper, and Torah keeping is a sign of weakness. But we know that if we read Romans 15, the first few verses, that Paul puts himself in the category of the strong. He says, we who are strong. Well, now we can connect the logic back together. If Paul was a lifelong Torah keeper, and Paul considers himself one of the strong, then weak cannot be a sign of, then Torah keeping cannot be a sign of weakness. It must be something else. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to hold to what Mark Nano says. So let's look at the question that we're going to look at tonight. It's only one verse long. The question is, how can we make for peace and mutual upbuilding? And I've, of course, created the question out of the verse that we're going to be studying. And so if we just look at the verse that's on my screen right now, this is Romans 14:9. I've got it reproduced for you here in my study from the ESV. It reads, so then let us pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. And again, this is within the context of Paul having his discussion about people with different food preferences, people with different fasting preferences, people with different understandings of the cultural setting of ancient Israel. Let me read the Greek for you real quick over on the right side of the page, and then we'll just jump right into exegeting this particular verse. The Greek says, Ara un tates erenes diokomen kai tates oikadames tes es allelus. That's the Greek reading from the SBL-G&T version of the Greek. All right, so if we scroll down and look at the notes, I've only got one paragraph that we're going to study tonight. It'll be very short. Again, keep in mind the greater context of Paul's statement about making for peace and mutual building. It's within the context of the judgmental attitudes that the different groups, the weak and the strong, had towards one another over this idea of food understanding, table fellowship preferences, keeping in mind that your historic Gentile Christian audience was coming from a culture that didn't have any strong food preferences, particularly trying to abstain from meat offered to idols or any type of special dietary list like God would have instructed Israel. Compare that with what Israel had been keeping for hundreds of years by this point in time. At least religious Jews of Paul's day would have tried to keep kosher to the best of their ability, abstaining from food that God said don't eat, abstaining from animals that God said were off limits, right? Go back and read Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 again. Also keep in mind that, we learned this during the technical part, there are Hebrew and Greek terms that are written in our Bibles that are used to describe animals that are clean and animals that are unclean, thus the foods that are produced from them. So we have clean and unclean in these technical terms. On top of that, religious Jews came along and added more terminology to distinguish between food that was otherwise permissible by God's standard, but had by man's standard become defiled or profane or common. The Greek word koinos refers to that which is handled by everyone. And so Paul says, I've learned from Yeshua that there's nothing really that's unclean in of itself. Instead of interpreting that term unclean from the English as if Paul is teaching his group that the dietary list has been uprooted, instead, it's better to go with the idea that Paul knew that Jesus taught that the law has not been abolished, and not one jot or one tittle will disappear from the law, right? Matthew 5:17 through 20, all over again. Instead, what Paul's trying to say is nothing is common in and of itself. Let's change that Greek word. Don't change the Greek word. Let's change the English translation back over into something that's a little more accurate to what the Greek was trying to portray. Paul's not saying that nothing is unclean in and of itself. Instead, he's trying to say nothing is common in and of itself. It's nothing is profane in and of itself, or unholy, or unsanctioned, or something like that. Dirty, we could even fill in. Instead, that's a man-made categorization, which is harmless in and of itself, as long as you're not going to fight about it, right? And since the Bible doesn't say either way whether something is common, right? The Bible doesn't tack on that label. That's a man's designation. It's harmless to use it, right? Person A says, no, I'm not going to eat that for whatever reason. Person B says, no, I'm fine with it. We're talking about what God says is permissible, right? That's the context. Well, then, as long as we don't fight over these as brothers in the Lord, well, then Paul's going to say we can have our differences of opinion when it comes to things that are common or not common. Everything really is innocent, he's going to go on to say later on, right, in the next verse, I think, verse 20. Everything really is clean, and the word clean there doesn't mean that there's no unclean animals. It means that everything's innocent. It's a form of the Greek word kathartos without the a in front of it. It's katharos, clean, and we looked at that last week as well. All right, so let's look this week at my notes here, and this is just one paragraph long, and then we'll turn to the Shema study. Here's what I have to say about Paul's statement about making for mutual upbuilding, peace and mutual building. I say, let us start this section by reviewing Mark Nano's historical perspective on the rhetorical implications from this letter. Keep in mind, I believe, and Mark Nass is going to just hit this on the head, I believe that the Christian communities, the Gentile Christians in Paul's day, we're still talking about the mid-50s to late 50s of his day, the Gentile Christians would have been largely attached to synagogue groups. They would have been operating underneath the umbrella term of Judaism. To be sure, there are a few places in the New Testament that describe Christianity as a sect of Judaism, right? A sect known as the Way, or the sect of the Nazarenes. And history also attests to this reality, that first century Christianity was a form of first century Judaism. It was one of the branches or denominations, if you want to use that modern terminology, of Judaism. It was seen by the Judaisms as another form of Judaism, and it was seen by the pagans as another form of Judaism, or the Romans or the Greeks. So it was seen from both within and from without as a form of Judaism, albeit a kind of a transcultural form of Judaism that was really pushing the limits when it came to certain understandings of how to keep the law, right? It was a very relaxed version of Judaism when it came to what Gentiles were expected to do. But nevertheless, this is important as we study Romans, because Paul would have expected the Gentile Christians to have not only a better appreciation for the Judaisms and the religion of Israel and the scriptures of Israel and access to them, but also he would have expected a certain amount of religious protection that was afforded by Rome to the Jewish groups to be extended over to Gentile Christians. Now, we're also operating, as I mentioned earlier in our study, with the understanding that there was a hurtful expulsion decree put out by Emperor Claudius around the same time, or a little earlier actually than Paul's letter, that would have decimated the Jewish communities to some extent. I don't believe it completely drove every Jew out of Rome. I tend to downplay it myself a little bit. That's my own biased opinion, but it is based on some historical accurate information that we did look at. Go back and look at my other study, or earlier in the study. I don't want to go through it right now. So this is the context that Mark Nanos is going to remind us of some of the details. Let's just read this part, and like I said, I won't wax long. Keep in mind, we're discussing the question about how can we as Jews and Gentiles in Messiah have a mutually upbuilding experience in the body of Messiah. What may have worked in the first century may not work today. This is true. That's just common sense. But there are timeless lessons in the Bible that we can and must draw from as we study this part of Paul's letter. We need to look at some of the problems that they faced in the first century between Jews and Gentiles and Messiah. How did they solve those problems? And then how can we make a practical application in today's 21st century Messianic communities where we still have some separation between Jews and Gentiles, some disagreements and some fights that break out, sometimes over food. Here's what Mark Nanos has to say. Of course, he's not going to be the final answer on this. It's just one perspective. In the formal opening of the letter, Paul introduces himself in language that would make little sense to a Greco-Roman person apart from learning the story of Christ within the context of the Jewish communal narrative, one that can be developed from Jewish scriptures but not elsewhere. So right away, we see that the Gentiles were brought into this relationship with God and into proximity with the commonwealth of Israel. Remind yourself about what Paul taught in Ephesians, the letter there, that those who were Gentiles who were formerly far off have now been, by the blood of Messiah and their faith in Messiah, brought near not only to God and Messiah, but brought near to the commonwealth of Israel. So much so that they now form what does he call it? They're fellow heirs and fellow citizens with the household of God, with the saints. So the perspective from the apostolic scriptures, of course, Paul wrote most of the apostolic scriptures, the perspective is always that Israel is the people that are near, and the Gentiles are the people that were far. Of course, we're talking about in proximity to the Spirit of God, the workings of God, the grace of God, the scriptures of God, the truths of God, all of those promises that God gave to Israel through the scriptures, the prophets. These put the people of Israel in a place where they were near to all of that. So think of like a target where you've got outer rings and then concentrated rings that keep going smaller and smaller as you get towards closer to the bullseye. The bullseye, in my little analogy here, would be God himself and all that God represents, right? His truth, his word, his promises, his covenants. And Israel would be those concentric circles around the bullseye. The Gentiles would represent those farther outer rings. They were farther away from those, right? They weren't familiar with the promises of God, the covenants of God, the nature of Messiah, all of that. So Paul wants to let them know, in Messiah, you've been brought near not only to God, but near to Israel. And this is carried on through the theme of Romans as well, using his olive tree analogy in Romans chapter 11. He describes it as two trees. The first tree, that is the close tree, is the cultivated olive tree. That's the family of Israel, the family of Abraham. And Paul describes these branches as being close, right? Close to the programs of God, the promises of God, the covenants of God. This doesn't mean that everyone's automatically saved. Don't misunderstand Paul's analogy. It's simply talking about a measure of grace that's poured out for people who are in closer proximity to God's program and what he's doing at any given time in history. That's the people and the nation of Israel, based on God's covenant promises to them and his inner workings with them as a people group. Bring in the wild olive tree. Who's the wild olive tree? It's the Gentiles who are off to the side, in Paul's analogy, who are, because of their faith in Messiah, being taken from their place of wild or are far away and being brought and grafted into and among the cultivated branches, namely the people of Israel, and more specifically the remnant of Israel, aka the Messianic Jewish groups that were coming to faith in Messiah in that day. So it's the same analogy that he uses in Ephesians chapters 2 and 3 that he uses in Romans 11 there. So that's the scope of the context of what Mark Nanos is trying to remind us of when Paul's writing to Romans. At the very least, we have to remind ourselves as we're studying chapter 14 that Paul has already written what he wrote in chapters 9 through 11, right? At the very least, they've already got that olive tree analogy behind them as they're reading this part of Paul's letter. So let's keep reading. This is Mark Nanos. He not only cites Jewish scriptures, speaking of Paul, which he will continue to do in the letter more than any extant letter, right? That's kind of fascinating in and of itself. If you compare all of Paul's letters against one another, he quotes from the scriptures, from the Jewish scriptures, more so in Romans than he does any other letter, which stop and ask yourself, the question is, we're going to look at this topic in a moment. Where would the Gentiles have had access to the scriptures of Israel? Do you think they own their own copies? You think they could just scroll down to the local Bible bookstore and pick up a copy of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, of the Torah? I don't think so. Where would the Gentiles have to go in order to read or hear the words of God being spoken in a public setting? You already know. It's the synagogue. We'll talk about that some more. So Paul quotes from the scriptures, from the Jewish scriptures, to bolster all of his arguments over and over again. Of course, he's probably quoting from the Greek Septuagint, which was already in circulation some 200, nearly 300 years earlier than Paul hit the scene. So Nanos, as a historian, as a Jewish historian, takes note that some 50 plus times Paul alludes to the scriptures, many more times, apparently assuming that the recipients would be competent to follow his line of thought. So the scriptures of Israel were vital for Paul's argument, right? You have to put yourself in this setting. Paul's writing a letter to the Romans, people he's never met, and they've never met him. And he's writing to them, and he's making all these heavy quotes from Jewish resources, the scriptures, the Bible of Paul's day, which would have been the Old Testament that we call, the Tanakh is what I call it. And so he's never met them, and many of the Gentiles have never, perhaps outside of a synagogue experience, seen or heard these particular scriptural references, right? In their own cultural setting as Greco-Roman citizens, they wouldn't have really had an appreciation or a need to know what the scriptures of Israel say. So how can we expect them to really trust what Paul's writing if they did not have, speaking of the Gentiles, if they did not have some close association with the synagogue groups at that time? I think it strains the context when we try to think of Jews and Gentiles as completely separated groups in Paul's day, reading back into Romans what we have by today's standards, which is a split from church and synagogue. I don't think we had the church and synagogue split as heavily as we would like to describe it in Paul's day yet. To be sure, I don't think there really was any split just yet. I don't think we're going to see the split until farther on down the road, particularly as we get closer to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish revolts, and things like that, the plowing out over of Jerusalem, and Rome's increased not just desire, but attempt, that's what I was looking for, Rome's increased attempt to squash these rebellious Jews who were kind of rising up against Rome. All right, so that's the context. Mark Nanos continues. Speaking about the scriptures of Israel, copies of these Jewish texts at this time written on scrolls that were expensive to acquire and apparently not well known outside of Jewish communities would presumably not be readily available, of course, to Gentiles. That's the context of what we're looking at, which all the more makes it vital that we place the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers close to one another, and those two groups particularly close to the synagogues. Even though we had an expulsion of Jewish people from Rome, like I said, it's likely that it was just a concentrated amount of Jews that were kicked out, a certain amount of troublemakers that got kicked out, or even if Claudius said all of you get out, the Jewish people didn't all go out. They didn't all leave. Many of them stayed. It's more likely that it was only a 5-year period that we're talking about, from the time of the decree to the time that Claudius himself was murdered, and Emperor Nero came into power. So that's not a lot of time to empty the land of Rome, of Italy, from all the Jews, right? It's not like they all could just hop on the next cargo plane and get out of Rome. It wasn't that easy, right? They had to, pack up, close business, close all of their contracts out, settle all their accounts, tidy up all their personal belongings, get everything packed, and then book a boat or something out of or wherever they were going, if they were going by ship, or maybe they're going north, into another part of another country, or east or west or something. Keep in mind, all of that would have taken time and money and effort, and they only had 5 short years in which all of this supposedly happened, and all the Jews. And we're talking on the low end, maybe 200,000 Jews, and on the high end, maybe even 500,000 Jews. It's just not really feasible that everyone really got out. So it's more likely that there was still a good Jewish presence in Rome when Paul wrote to the Romans, wrote to the Roman church. To be sure, we know that the decree had been reversed, and the Jewish people, or at least those who did leave, were allowed to come back in. Right, Priscilla and Aquila were already back in country, and they had gotten kicked out. So we know so because if you read to the end of the chapter of Romans 16, that he mentions Priscilla and Aquila. So the point is, as we're reading through this part of my study here, it's better to just factor in the reality that Jews and Gentiles still had access to the synagogue communities, and the break and the split between church and synagogue had not really been finalized yet, or wasn't even really strengthened at this time. Here's what Nanos says. Moreover, speaking of Paul's recipients, most of his audience would probably only know the letter when read aloud. And this includes Jews as well, right? Religious Jews would have memorized heavy parts of the Torah, but at the same time, owning a personal copy of a Torah scroll wasn't something that your average Jew, certainly your average Gentile, didn't have access to. And Nano says, since most people of Paul's time, some 80 to 90% being the normal estimates of those people, they couldn't even read. Right, illiteracy rate. The illiteracy rate was pretty high in that time, as was expected. Reading was a luxury that you could only afford if you had a certain amount of money and a certain amount of access to teachers who could teach you how to read. Your average person, and this is corroborated by other historians, not just Mark Nanos, your average person in Paul's day was illiterate. Right? That was just the norm. That's just the way it worked. Which is why when it came to studying the Torah or the scriptures, it was more of an oral exercise. It was more something that was passed along from a teacher to student by mouth. Teachers taught and students listened and memorized and things like that. It wasn't like, okay, everybody, when you get home, open your Bible and turn to, chapter blah, blah, blah. That doesn't work. It didn't work that way. So we need to put all of this into perspective when we're talking about Jews and Gentiles appreciating what Paul's trying to teach them from God's Word, and corroborate all of Paul's references to the Tanakh. And at the same time, how could this be possible unless the Gentile groups were still connected closely enough to the synagogue groups that they had access to hearing the words of God, the Torah scrolls being taught and things like that. Nanos continues, how then, and he asked the same question that I did, how then would they know the scriptures speaking about the Gentiles? How would they know the scriptures upon which his arguments were based apart from being socialized into Jewish communal life and its symbolic system for making sense of reality, or for that matter, of spirituality? We're still asking the question, how can they make for mutual peace and upbuilding as two groups that were separated by their socio-religious understandings of certain parts of the Bible? And that's really the question that we should be asking today as well. I think I'll stop in the commentary here and pick this up next week and just kind of entertain, just for the last few minutes, some questions that we might bring up by today's standards. We'll read this last section here next week, and we'll kind of draw it to a conclusion there. But the question we could ask by today's communities, we've got Jews and Gentiles who worship together in church settings. Most synagogues are free from Gentile Christian presence for the most part, as far as I can tell. In my experience, in the last 25 or so years that I've been worshiping as a Messianic Jew, with access to synagogues or churches. Your average Christian that I encountered over the last 25 years as a Christian myself is not really interested in visiting a non-Christian synagogue. In other words, a traditional synagogue. It's just not on their bucket list. It's not something that people are interested in doing. So most churches that I have been invited to speak at, or that I visited, or anything like that, if I ask the pastor or any of the congregants, hey, have you ever been to a traditional synagogue? Most people don't raise their hand. You may have one or two people, but for the most part, it's just not something that Gentile Christians are doing. On the flip side, most Jewish people are not visiting churches, and they're not interested in doing so. The rabbi doesn't want his Jewish congregants visiting Christian churches and investigating what Christians believe. For the most part, that's what's going on. And most Jewish people in synagogues don't expect to see Gentiles coming into their church doors. So we have a drastically different social setting today than we had in Paul's day. But we still have the same responsibility as Gentile believers and Jewish believers to follow Paul's admonition to make for mutual upbuilding, right? Let me go back and up to the verse again. Paul admonishes us to pursue what makes for peace and mutual building. He's speaking to Jews and Gentiles of his day, believers in Messiah, and those unbelieving Jews who would have been part of the larger faith community. But at the same time, Paul's letter is timeless. The Holy Spirit has preserved this letter for us today. We, today's communities, also have to pursue what makes for peace and mutual building. How can we do that? And so we could talk about how we can have better dialogue between Jews and Gentiles when it comes to these misunderstandings of how to keep Torah, what parts of Torah are still relevant. We could talk about a better way to understand the scriptures together. We can study together under using some of the original languages, Hebrew and Greek and things like that. But either way, and I'm just skimming over this tonight, we'll get more into this next week. Either way, what's pertinent for us, germane to my study, as I draw this part to a close, is that we have the responsibility to pursue what makes for peace. And of course, we already know, and I'll just kind of reveal some of what I believe is the answer. We already know that as Jews and Gentiles in Messiah, He is the one that's going to unify us as a people group. We've got to set our priorities straight. Instead of focusing on the things that divide us, like our cultural differences, our socio-religious understandings of what passages are relevant for us and things like that, what we can start with is our shared agreement on who Messiah is, the relevancy of His atonement in our lives, the importance of fellowshipping with one another as brothers and sisters in Messiah, the relevancy of the cross, the power of the Holy Spirit among us, God is our common Father, things like that. Those are the things that are going to strengthen and build us and make for peace and mutual building. That's where we need to start. So we'll look at more of this next week, but for now, that'll do it for Romans 14 Unplugged. Feast and fast and food, oh my.